Hello, Chris again. Let's talk about snapping and advanced movement. So, as discussed before, when we are in any of the translation tools where we can move, rotate, or scale, these widgets, the color coding is important, right? So, yellow means that that particular movement type for this action has been selected. So if I want to move this up and down, right, in the y-axis, I can click on the y-axis arrow, and now it is yellow. So I know that that is now selected. So instead of clicking on the arrow and moving it up and down, I can just, with this selected, middle mouse click and drag anywhere in the viewport, and it will move it. So make sure, go ahead and try this now and make sure that this is working for you and that you understand this concept, right? So click on any of the directions that's selected, and then middle mouse click and drag anywhere on the screen without clicking on the arrow, and notice how it moves it around. Great. Here I have a cube. Notice that it is all deformed, right? So let's say I actually don't want this shape, and I need to fix this and make it look like, make the profile look like a cube again. So I'm gonna go to vertex mode, and I can do this by moving vertices, right? So I could move this up and try and eyeball it, right? So if I came over to my orthographic view, and this is a really inefficient, inaccurate way to do this. It's also slow. So you could get this correct, but the better way to do this would be to use vert snapping. So we already learned about grid snapping, right? Where you hold X and you can snap to increments on the grid. So vert snapping is similar, but instead of increments on the grid, you can snap to coordinates that other vertices in the scene hold. So in this circumstance, let me go back to this view, I can snap this. I know I want to snap it up, and I want it to match the height of these vertices, right? Like this, any of these vertices. So I'm going to select the up arrow, the y-axis arrow, and now that I know it is yellow, I can hold V, as in vertex. I can hold V on the keyboard, and while holding V, I can middle mouse click and drag over top of a vertex that I want it to snap to. So I'm going to middle mouse click and drag, and you can see it snaps immediately to that height, and it is perfectly lined up. So that goes for any vertex in the scene, right? I'm holding V and I'm hovering over different vertices with the middle mouse button. So this one, I need to vertex snap it to this, like to this vertex. So I'm going to click on the X axis direction, so that's yellow, hold V for vertex snapping, and then middle mouse click and drag. And then you can see it is perfectly lined out. Let's say I want the height to be at this height, so I'm going to hold V, click on the Y axis, move it up. Let's click on the Z axis, hold V, and middle mouse click to get it back there. So that is vertex snapping. It is extremely useful, and the more you model, the more you'll realize how useful it can be. Let's talk about pivot manipulation. So here we have an object, and the pivot is where the object rotates around. Typically, on an object like a polygon primitive, the pivot is located at the center of the volume for the object. You can see the pivot here is located in the center of the cube. Frequently, especially when you are grouping, ungrouping, or combining and separating, the pivot will move and it will be off center. So if I were to try, let's say I wanted to rotate this, it's going to rotate around that pivot. And frequently that is not what you want. So if you want to get your pivot back in the center, you need to center the pivot, and as a refresher, that's either under modify, center pivot, or you can select the object and click on this little icon here, center pivot. Now you see it's back in the center. Very frequently, we need to move the pivot to more easily manipulate and model our objects. So let's talk about moving the pivot. So to unlock the pivot so that you can move it around and manipulate it, with the object selected, hit D as in delta on your keyboard. I just hit D, and you can see now I have this sort of bullseye in the center, along with transform tools to move the pivot. So I could select, this arrow or up here and just kind of move it around. And notice how it's not moving the actual object, it's just moving the pivot for the object. And if I were to hit D again, then you'll see that, okay, now the pivot's in that place. And now, the object rotates and moves and scales based on that pivot location. So using our knowledge of how to access the pivot by hitting D, as well as our knowledge of vertex snapping, we can easily manipulate the pivot to very useful points on an object. For example, I just hit D. If I hold V, middle mouse click over this vertex, or perhaps this one, and then hit D again, now the pivot is located on this corner. And if I wanted to, I could hold V or hold X and vertex snap it directly to the bottom of the grid, right? It's vertex snap. I could snap it over here, right? I could do some rotation based on that pivot as well. So this is very helpful. Let's say we have another object, right? This object's over here, and I want to line this object up directly on this vertex at the top. So I can turn vertex on shading on, or wireframe on shading on, and then select this cube. And instead of selecting just one axis, I could select this middle square, meaning that it will move in all axes. And then I can hold V and vertex snap it so that that corner of the cube is directly lined up with this vertex in the middle of the cylinder. So this is very helpful when you want to line things up or attach things in specific ways. So that is vertex snapping. So take a moment of your own time to create some polygon primitives and practice vertex snapping them to each other, as well as manipulating the pivot point by hitting D and vertex snapping the pivot point to another location. Something useful about this is, your pivot doesn't have to be on the object, as we saw earlier. So if I knew I wanted a bunch of bolts or something on a disk, I could do something like this where I unlock the pivot, move the pivot to the center, then hit D again, and then I could hit Control D to duplicate it, right, and move this around and continue to duplicate. There are really quick and easy ways to do this, but this is just an example of sort of the power of pivot manipulation. Great. In the next video, we are going to look at mirroring and exporting objects. See you there.